Whenever we start something new, there's usually some element of fear. A new job, a new school, the first time speaking publicly in front of a large number of people. There's uncertainty with new experiences, which can cause a certain level of anxiety, wondering whether people will accept you, if you'll do the job well, or what the job entails. Well, every year when I was at St. Francis with the school, we would celebrate the feast of St. Joseph the Worker with the St. Joseph altar. And the fourth graders, they would tell the origin story, and then I would lead the prayers. Well, one year, the group of fourth graders, they were nervous, and they asked me how I do this so well without getting nervous. And I told them that it was their first time, but I'd been doing this a while. Now, fast forward a couple years, and those same children are lectors at Mass, and they're comfortable in front of a large number of people. And what this shows us is that as we grow more familiar with something, we become more comfortable, which can be a good thing. We can do our job well, and we're no longer hindered by our nerves or uncertainty. But this could also go to the other extreme, where we get so comfortable that we become complacent. We suddenly don't work as hard as we once did. We may even use company time to do our own thing. With priests, the church, she puts a limit on how many masses that we can celebrate each day. Without the permission of the bishop, we can't go over that number of masses. And it's a good thing because, like anything else, the mass risks becoming a habit where we're just doing it rather than praying it. And we priests could easily get comfortable and no longer be engaged in the mysteries that we celebrate. And this can happen with our duties, but it can also happen with people. In our gospel today, we heard how Jesus went into his hometown, and the people there didn't accept him. They were familiar with him. They saw him grow up. They knew his parents. And because of this, they weren't able to make that transition from the questions they had about him, where did this man get all of this, to the answer from God, and that Jesus is the Messiah. There's that saying that familiarity breeds contempt, which means that the closer we are to someone, it can lead to a loss of respect and admiration for that person. We no longer appreciate them. And this happens a lot in life. We undervalue or neglect those things that are closest to us. For example, how often do we think about what's been given to us and give thanks to God for those things? Many times people are thinking of the next thing, and they're never satisfied with what they have. Someone once said that as soon as we satisfy our curiosity about a person or a thing, our valuation of that person or thing goes down. A distant thing is imagined to be perfect or idealistic, but when it's nearby, accessible, or available, its imperfections, weaknesses, or limitations come to our knowledge, and it falls in our estimation. Now, obviously, Jesus, he didn't have any imperfections, but the ideal of the Messiah the Jews had in their mind, it stood in stark contrast to the reality of the Messiah. And for them, this was disappointing because they expected the Messiah to be something he wasn't, and they weren't ready to take that leap of faith and trust in Jesus. It's like a continuation of the situation that Ezekiel found himself in our first reading. God sent him to people who had rejected him. He said that they and their ancestors have revolted against me to this very day. Well, when the Jews reject Jesus, they're following in the footsteps of their ancestors. They have all the evidence they need to believe in him. His works and words point to him as being the Messiah, but they knew him, and so they rejected him. Now, I'd like you to keep this idea of familiarity in mind because I'm going to shift for just a second. So something that we learn in theology about Jesus is that he has a triple office of priest, prophet, and king. And Bishop Barron said this. He said, as priest, he sanctifies. That is to say, he reestablishes the lost link between divinity and humanity. As prophet, he speaks and embodies the divine truth. And as king, he leads us on the right path, giving guidance to the human project. You might say that as priest, he is the life. As prophet, he is the truth. And as king, he is the way. Well, at our baptism, we are all incorporated into Christ, and so we each participate in varying degrees in this triple office of Christ. As priests, we offer sacrifice and intercede on behalf of others. As prophets, we go out and speak the truth. And as kings, we guide others along the right path. And there's different roles that we can play as prophets. Some are sent as missionaries to foreign lands to preach the gospel. Others, they remain at home, preaching the gospel to family, friends, and co-workers. But if you think about it, depending on who that is, the missionary may be easier because our family, friends, and co-workers, they know us. They're familiar with us. And so like with Jesus, they may not take us seriously and reject what we have to say. But what's important is that we preach the gospel nonetheless. If our family and friends don't accept what we say, then perhaps we should speak less and evangelize by the way we live our faith and by practicing works of charity towards others. But I will caution that as we live our faith, we need to be on guard against us becoming the ones so familiar with God that we become complacent. This is when we no longer appreciate God and the things that He's given us. Or we may think that we've reached the heights of holiness and there's no room to grow. Or we've got God figured out and we're not impressed. I think a little dose of humility helps to bring us back to reality. It grounds us. And this is what happened with St. Paul in our second reading. He was given a great knowledge of God. And afterwards, God allowed what Paul said, an angel of Satan to beat him. And it kept him humble. But he also learned from that experience that his trials and sufferings were a participation in the cross of Christ. And so he was able to rejoice, saying, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and constraints for the sake of Christ. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. And so, despite the great knowledge that Paul had of God, he still had to learn. He had room to grow, to be evangelized himself, so that he wouldn't become complacent and prideful, thinking that he had it all figured out. Wherever we are in our spiritual lives, brothers and sisters, there's always room for us to grow. Even the saints had need of continuous conversion. If you're too familiar with others, you may not be open to what they have to say. But if we're humble and admit that there's always work to be done on our path to sanctity, then we'll better live out our prophetic role of evangelization because we'll allow ourselves to be evangelized and perhaps learn some of the greatest spiritual truths from those closest to us.